I knew the ocean always held secrets. It was impossible to spend so many years as an oceanographer and not recognize that there was more down there than science could explain. But until then, all I had were assumptions, nothing more than theories. Until this expedition, I received an offer from a private company that claimed to have discovered a completely unexplored region of the ocean floor off the east coast of the United States, beyond what our standard equipment could reach. They needed someone with experience to lead the operation. Money was never a motivation for me, but the chance to explore something no one had ever seen was irresistible. So I accepted. The plan was simple. We would spend weeks in a submarine designed to reach extreme depths, descending in progressive levels to map the ocean layers. The crew was composed of 6 people, all with extensive experience at sea. There were no amateurs among us. They were marine biologists, engineers, and even a specialist in ocean acoustics, responsible for interpreting the sounds of the depths. At first, everything went as expected. We were excited, which is normal for this type of expedition. Newness is always stimulating, especially when it involves the unknown. But after 3 days, the first signs that something was wrong began to appear. The first time, it was subtle. The sonar detected a mass moving below us, but it disappeared before we could capture it on the imaging monitors. A kind of fleeting shadow. No one paid much attention. The ocean floor is vast, filled with creatures we barely know. What we saw could have been just a large school of fish, or perhaps a whale passing by. Anything could have been responsible for the brief sonar interference. But as we descended, these phenomena began to repeat. First, it was the shadow, always appearing for a fraction of a second and vanishing as quickly as it came. Then, the sounds. Small, distorted echoes that no one could identify. The acoustic specialist said they didn't sound like anything he had ever heard. It wasn't the sound of whales, nor the noise from tectonic plates. It was something different. Something empty. The temperature readings were also strange. Areas of the ocean that should be icy, given the depth, showed sudden heat spikes. A malfunction in the equipment, we thought. But it wasn't that. We checked several times, replaced sensors, and the problem persisted. In one of the strangest moments, while descending deeper, everyone in the submarine's control room began to feel a kind of vibration. It wasn't a physical tremor. It was more like a hum resonating in our ears. A low and persistent frequency that seemed to travel through the steel hull of the submarine. When we tried to identify its source, we found nothing. The sound came from all directions and at the same time from nowhere. Tensions began to rise. The environment, which had once been exciting and productive, became heavy. Everyone grew quieter. I noticed the crew's looks were becoming increasingly suspicious, as if they were expecting something or someone to emerge on the horizon of the cameras. Then, on the morning of the 5th day, we were awakened by a loud bang. It wasn't a sound that came from outside the submarine. It came from within. Something had fallen or been knocked over. But when we checked all the compartments, we found nothing out of place. The internal cameras recorded nothing unusual, but we all heard it and we all felt it. I tried to keep my focus on work. I kept my team busy with routines, checking equipment and updating readings. But the truth is, at that point, I was starting to feel uneasy as well. There was something strange in the way the ocean seemed to surround us. The darkness felt much denser than I remembered from other expeditions. It seemed to have a presence, a weight, as if something was waiting for us out there, just watching. The worst happened on the 10th night. We had adjusted our position to descend to a new depth, an area completely mapped by satellite, but never physically explored. When we reached the planned depth, the monitors captured something that froze us. It was a blurred and almost indistinct image. But there was a shape. It wasn't natural. It couldn't be. It was large, much bigger than any submarine or sunken ship, and it seemed alive. We stared at the monitor for minutes that felt like hours. We tried to increase the resolution of the cameras, adjust the focus, but we couldn't capture more details. But we knew it was there. Everyone in the submarine felt it. It was as if something was emerging from the depths of our consciousness, a hidden truth that refused to be ignored. And then, it vanished, simply disappeared from the monitor. But the feeling that we were being watched didn't go away. On the contrary, it seemed to grow with each passing minute. In the following days, behaviors began to change. The crew became even tenser. One of the biologists had a nervous breakdown. He started screaming, claiming that something was moving in the shadows of the submarine, something we couldn't see. We had to confine him to the medical bay, and since then he hasn't stopped murmuring about eyes in the darkness watching us. That shook everyone. I began to see things too. At first, I thought they were just shadows on the screens, distortions caused by tiredness, or the pressure our minds were under. But it wasn't just that. I saw figures in the corridors of the submarine, shapes that seemed to slide between the walls, as if trying to hide from me but at the same time drawing me in. It was hard to maintain sanity. The pressure of the water kilometers above our heads, the absolute darkness surrounding us, the constant feeling that we were being watched. It was as if something out there knew we were getting too close, as if it didn't want us to see what was truly hidden in the ocean's depths. That night, after failing to sleep for hours, I finally left my cabin. The corridor was deserted, silent, but that low hum still persisted. I felt an inexplicable urge to go to the control room, as if something was calling me. When I entered, everything seemed normal, except for the monitor. That monitor that had previously displayed only depth data and sonar maps now showed something different. It appeared to be a series of patterns, lines, and symbols that made no sense. None of the alarms were sounding. No technical failures had been recorded. And yet, the monitor seemed to be transmitting some kind of message. I stood there, staring at it for too long. Later, when I tried to explain what I saw, no one believed me, but I knew there was something down there, something that was trying to communicate with me, or perhaps warn me. It was no longer just an expedition. We were in forbidden territory, and something in the depths knew we were there. I still don't know how to define what I saw on that monitor that night, but what came next only confirmed what I feared. The ocean, with all its vastness and mystery, harbors secrets that none of us should attempt to unravel, and I was starting to regret having tried. The hours dragged on in a strange way, as if time were folding in on itself, lost in the expanse of the ocean. Every minute stretched out, turning the days aboard the submarine into an endless sequence of tension and silence. Nothing was as it had been. The crew, once excited and curious, was sinking into a state of growing apathy, as if something were slowly draining their energy. I felt isolated, despite being surrounded by people, and, in a way, I knew we all felt the same. When we decided to dive even deeper, I felt a pang of apprehension. It was as if an invisible force were pressing down on us, a resistance that was not physical, but psychological. It was impossible to ignore. Nevertheless, we pressed on. What else could we do? We were there to explore. It was our mission. Even though now there was something more sinister watching us. The submarine began to descend into a completely unknown area. No previous equipment had recorded any significant data about this region. The depth was greater than anything we had ever explored, and even the submarine's advanced systems were being pushed to their limits. The sonar readings were confusing. There were distortions, as if something were interfering directly with the equipment. It was a type of interference I had never seen before. It felt almost intentional, as if someone or something was trying to blind us. I looked at the faces of the crew. Everyone was pale, eyes glued to the screens, waiting for something they couldn't identify. An unsettling silence took over the environment. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all waiting for the worst. Then it happened. The submarine shook violently, as if it had been struck by a colossal force. Alarms began to blare, flashing an unsettling red as the sound of metal twisting filled the cabin. The crew panicked. I barely had time to react before another impact hit us, this time even stronger. I looked at the monitors, trying to understand what was happening. The image was distorted, but I managed to distinguish a shape, an enormous, undefined thing moving in the darkness around us. It was larger than anything I had ever seen. The sonar couldn't properly capture it, as if the very presence of the creature distorted the space around it. It was like looking at a blur, a living void. With the submarine trembling and the screams of the crew echoing around me, my mind clung to rationality. We needed to get out of there. I ordered an immediate ascent, but the controls were sluggish, almost as if the submarine were being held back by something beyond normal physics. It was as if the very water around us had become denser, trapping us. At that moment, I realized we were not dealing with something natural. There was an intelligence there, something that was watching us, that knew where we were and what we were doing, and, more frighteningly, something that seemed to be enjoying our panic. With the submarine finally beginning to respond to the commands, we tried to retreat from the area as quickly as possible, but the creature, or whatever it was, continued to follow us, its immense size obscuring the sensors and our view. It was as if the ocean itself were alive, with invisible eyes fixed on every movement we made. The crew was on the brink of collapse. One of the engineers, who was usually calm and composed, began to scream in terror, pointing at the observation window. I looked, and for a brief moment, I saw something that made me doubt my own sanity. Outside, in the ocean's darkness, there was a light. It wasn't a natural light, like that of bioluminescent creatures, but something artificial, pulsating in a rhythmic, controlled manner. It was impossible. I knew that. Nothing could survive those depths without being crushed by the pressure. And yet, the light was there, oscillating in a hypnotizing way. A chilling sensation crept up my spine. It wasn't just the light. There was something else out there. Something that seemed to be lurking, watching our movements. It was as if the darkness around the submarine was taking shape, molding itself into figures I could only glimpse out of the corner of my eye. But every time I turned my head, they vanished, merging back into the darkness. It was maddening. Panic quickly spread through the crew. One of the biologists, already shaken from the previous events, began to ramble incessantly about humanoid shapes in the depths. He insisted he saw faces carved in the darkness, but no one could confirm what he was saying. It was as if the very ocean were toying with our minds, distorting reality and driving us to madness. After what felt like hours, we managed to ascend to a safer depth. The tremors of the submarine ceased, and the creature, or whatever it was, vanished from our radar. The relief was palpable, but I knew something still wasn't right. The days that followed were strange. We tried to continue the expedition, but there was a constant tension in the air. The crew barely spoke to one another, and every movement was made with an almost superstitious caution. The nights were the worst. Whenever I tried to sleep, I heard strange noises coming from the submarine's corridors. It was as if something were crawling along the walls, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. One night, I woke to the sound of tapping. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but continuous. I got out of bed, my heart racing, and followed the sound to the control room. When I arrived, I found one of the engineers standing in front of the observation window, his eyes glazed over, fixed on something I couldn't see. "Are you okay?" I asked, approaching cautiously. He didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, staring into the darkness outside. I called to him again, but there was no answer. When I placed my hand on his shoulder, he finally turned to me, but his eyes were empty, as if something had drained all his energy, all his will to live. I led him back to his cabin, where he lay down without saying a word. It was as if I were in a trance, lost somewhere deep within my own mind. As the days passed, other crew members began to exhibit similar symptoms. There was something out there, something affecting us in ways I couldn't comprehend. It was on the 20th night that everything changed. We were monitoring a particularly deep area when our sensors picked up a new reading. This time, it wasn't the creature we had encountered before. It was something else. Something solid. The sonar displayed a colossal structure buried at the ocean floor, thousands of meters below us. It was impossible. No man-made structure could survive at those depths. But there it was, clear as day on the monitors. A massive form, constructed of materials I had never seen before. It had perfect lines, as if sculpted with precision. As we approached, the alarms began to sound again. This time, it was radiation readings. Something about that structure was emitting a type of energy our sensors couldn't decipher. It felt like we were near a nuclear plant, yet the type of radiation didn't match anything known. Then, the lights went out. For a brief moment, everything in the submarine plunged into total darkness, and the humming returned, louder than ever, reverberating through the hull of the submarine, as if we were inside a giant bell being struck incessantly. Everyone froze, fear etched on their faces. When the lights finally came back on, we were face to face with the structure. It was even more imposing than I had imagined. A titanic construction that seemed to defy all laws of physics and logic. One of the monitors began to show signs of movement within the structure. There was motion, though the details were indistinct. Shadows seemed to dance slowly, almost hypnotically. But what was clear was that we were not alone. Something else was inside. Something that was waiting for us. We decided to return to the surface before it was too late. The atmosphere on board was suffocating, as if the very air was compressing us. But the worst was yet to come. As we began our ascent, the systems started to fail again. The submarine shook, alarms blared, the lights flickered, and the sound of metal twisting returned. It felt as if something was trying to pull us back down, back to that structure, to whatever awaited us inside. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't a sound from the speakers or from any crew member. It was a low voice, almost a whisper, resonating inside my head. It called my name, and then, just one phrase, "You shouldn't have come." In that moment, I knew we had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Something deep in the ocean, something ancient and powerful, had awakened, and it wasn't willing to let us go. The ascent was slow and torturous. Each meter gained felt like a miracle. But we all knew, deep down, that the ocean wouldn't let us escape so easily. The climb continued to be slow. Every meter that distanced us from the ocean floor felt increasingly difficult, as if the ocean itself was dragging us down, resisting all our efforts to escape. The submarine's lights continued to flicker, and the sharp sound of metal twisting wouldn't leave us. The hull creaked. The submarine trembled. All systems were under immense pressure, and failures were constant. The silence among us was broken only by alarms, the mechanical sounds of machines struggling to function, and occasionally the terrified murmurs of the crew. I kept my eyes fixed on the control panel, watching the erratic readings. I knew we were at the limit of our capabilities, both physically and mentally. Whatever was down there, be it that creature or the structure, had affected us profoundly. I could feel the weight of it on each of our shoulders, and yet no one dared to speak about what we all knew. Something more was happening, something we couldn't explain. Chief Engineer Parker was desperately trying to stabilize the systems, but with each passing moment he seemed more exhausted. Sweat dripped down his face, his hands trembling over the controls. He was one of the most competent members of the team, but even he was being shaken by the unbearable tension. I could see the growing fear in his eyes, that fear none of us could fully admit, but was present in every heavy breath and every frightened glance. Then suddenly, without warning, the submarine was violently shaken. A massive impact hit us, throwing everyone to the floor. I heard a sharp sound, someone's body colliding with a metal wall, followed by a scream. The submarine tilted slightly, and for a moment, I thought we were going to sink. I tried to get up, my heart racing, but the lights went out once more, plunging us into complete darkness. The only thing we could hear was the sound of gasping breaths, the tension building like a rising tide of panic. The alarms stopped, and the silence was deafening. I felt the buzzing in my head again, louder, as if it were inside my skull, vibrating, reverberating. It was an impossible sensation to ignore, something far beyond any common interference. Suddenly, one of the monitors flickered on, glowing faintly in the control room. At first, it was just static, zigzagging horizontal lines on the screen. But soon, it began to show something that made my blood run cold. There, at the bottom of the ocean, captured by the deep-sea cameras, was the silhouette of what had followed us previously. But this time, it appeared closer, clearer. It was a monstrous figure, a gigantic shadow, its contours poorly defined, as if the ocean itself was hiding it. The most disturbing part, however, was that we could now see something else. A flickering glow emanating from the creature. It wasn't ordinary bioluminescence. It was an organized light, as if it were blinking in some kind of pattern. A pattern I recognized. We were being watched. That wasn't just a deep-sea creature. It was something more intelligent, something aware of our presence, and somehow communicating with us. But the message was obscure, threatening. That blinking light, it was a language I didn't understand, but the overall meaning was clear. We were in forbidden territory. Parker managed to get to his feet with difficulty, trying to stabilize the submarine. As he ran his fingers over the controls, I noticed that the readings were even more confusing. The submarine was rising, but it felt as if we weren't going anywhere at all. It was as if the ocean was surrounding us, holding us with an invisible force. Every attempt to move forward was thwarted by this indescribable pressure, as if we were moving in circles within a maze made of water. Finally, the lights flickered back on, flashing with a disturbing intensity. However, something was wrong. A high-pitched sound began to echo through the structure of the submarine, and the readings on the control panel showed internal pressure levels that made no sense. The external pressure was rising anomalously, as if the water around us was being compressed by a colossal force. The submarine trembled again. This time I felt a more visceral fear. I could hear the hull groaning, almost as if it was about to give way. Outside, the monitor flickered once more, revealing the creature, or whatever it was, drawing closer. It was coming straight for us. I looked at Parker, and he simply shook his head. There was nothing we could do. The crew descended into panic. Some began to scream, while others just stood frozen, paralyzed by terror. I felt my heart racing, blood running cold through my veins. Whatever was out there was coming for us, and we were completely powerless against that force. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and this time, the control panel began shutting down on its own. Parker was shouting orders, but no one could move. The submarine was completely out of control. It was as if we were being pulled into something. We didn't know if it was the creature or some type of invisible force, but we were being taken to the depths. I tried to focus, attempted to think of an escape, but the options were non-existent. There was no way to stop what was happening. All we could do was wait and hope the submarine would hold together. But deep down, I knew that was an illusion. We were no match for whatever awaited us. And then, at the height of the panic, everything stopped. The submarine became still. The pressure seemed to stabilize, and for a moment, there was silence again. But it wasn't the kind of silence that brings relief. It was the kind of silence that precedes something terrible. I knew we weren't out of danger. I was just starting to understand what was really happening. I looked at the monitor once more, and what I saw made me stop breathing. The creature was now fully visible. There was no longer any doubt that it was conscious, intelligent. And the most frightening part, there was something familiar about its movements, something that resembled human ways, almost deliberate. It wasn't an irrational monster. It was a cold, calculated presence. It was then that, for the first time, I heard something beyond the buzzing and mechanical noises. It was a clear sound, coming from outside the submarine, like a song. It was something soft, distant, but it struck me deeply. It was as if the very water was carrying the melody, transmitting it to our ears. The music felt ancient, primitive, and at the same time filled with a strange sadness. No one else spoke. Everyone in the control room was entranced, listening to that sound that seemed to pull our consciousnesses out of our bodies. I knew that if we let it take us, we wouldn't come back, but it was impossible to resist. The music was hypnotic, filled with a terrible beauty, and I found myself on the brink of surrendering completely to that force. Then something broke. An explosion of noise echoed through the submarine, and everyone was thrown against the walls again. The music vanished abruptly, replaced by the deafening sound of water gushing in. The submarine was leaking. We could hear the desperate sound of water flooding into the lower part of the vessel. It was the worst thing that could happen at these depths. A small leak could quickly turn into an implosion. Parker began shouting orders, trying to locate the leak, but chaos consumed everyone. I found myself running back and forth, unsure of what to do, until I finally pinpointed the rupture. It was small but enough to compromise the hull. The ocean's pressure was slowly infiltrating, and there wasn't much we could do to contain it. As we struggled to control the leak, the submarine began to tremble again. This time, it felt different. It was as if we were being lifted by an external force, pulled upward with increasing speed. I looked at the monitors, and what I saw terrified me even more. We were rising, but not under our own control. Something was carrying us. I glanced at Parker, who was pale, his eyes wide with pure terror. He knew as well as I did what that meant. We weren't being rescued. We were being taken. When we finally emerged, the sunlight blinded our eyes. The submarine swayed on the waves, and the sound of water rushing through the hull finally ceased. But something was wrong. Upon exiting the cabin and reaching the deck, I was met with a surreal sight. We were somewhere unknown. This was not the departure point of our expedition. The ocean around us was calm, vast, and silent, but there was a sense that something was lurking, watching, waiting. The air was still, and the buzzing, that horrible buzzing, still persisted. But now, somehow, it seemed more distant, like an echo of something that had left us, but not entirely. At that moment I realized that it didn't matter how far we had risen. What was at the bottom of the ocean wouldn't stay down there forever. We were marked by something far beyond our understanding. When we emerged into that strange surface, I understood that everything had changed. The air around us was thick, laden with an uncomfortable humidity that clung to my skin like a layer of grime. The waters around us were still unnaturally motionless, as if we were suspended in a space that shouldn't exist. The silence was oppressive, but not the kind that brings peace. It was the kind of silence that precedes a terrible revelation. The crew slowly exited the cabin, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. No one could look directly at each other. We all knew, without needing to say it, that something was terribly wrong. The sea around us was unfamiliar. We had no idea where we were, and the navigation system's coordinates were completely misaligned. The GPS showed impossible readings. Apparently, we were in nowhere. I tried to contact the surface, calling the support ship and any coastal station that might be able to hear us. But the radio was dead, emitting only static. It was as if we were completely isolated from the world, as if reality itself was distorted around us. What had brought us to the surface was not rescuing us. It was as if we were being held there, suspended between two worlds, with no way to escape. Parker's eyes were glazed over, empty of any hope. He stared at the horizon, but I knew he saw nothing. He was lost within himself, perhaps still hearing that distant song which, for a brief moment, almost dragged us to the depths. I approached him, trying to awaken him, but his eyes remained fixed, as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he could not awaken. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew began to disperse around the submarine, wandering aimlessly. Each was lost in their own thoughts, their minds clearly affected by what we had experienced. I too felt a growing pressure in my chest, an oppressive feeling that something was lurking, waiting to reveal itself. Then I saw something in the water. A small ripple broke the still surface of the ocean, just a few meters from the submarine. I moved closer to the edge, trying to understand what was happening. For a brief moment, I thought it might be a hallucination. But it wasn't. A shadow passed beneath the submarine, long and sinuous, like a tentacle moving with impossible grace. I stepped back, my heart racing. Every instinct screamed for me to get out of there, but my legs were frozen. Whatever had brought us to the surface was still with us. It had not let us go. I shouted to the others, "There's something here," but they seemed incapable of reacting, as if they were numb. I looked at Parker again, but he was still distant, lost in his own mind. I needed to act. I needed to get them out of there. But how? The sound of something tapping against the hull of the submarine made me shudder. It was a hollow, repetitive sound, as if something were probing the structure, testing its resilience. Another sound, deeper and reverberating, began to echo in the distance. A sound I recognized immediately. It was the same sound we had heard in the depths. The low, constant hum that seemed to rise from the bowels of the ocean had returned. Only now, it was closer. I knew we couldn't stay there. We needed to get the submarine working again to find a way out of that place before something worse happened. I approached one of the engineers, shaking him by the shoulders until he finally looked me in the eyes, his expression still filled with terror, but now with a glimmer of awareness. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "Let's go back inside and try to fix the systems." He nodded slowly, and together we returned to the interior of the submarine. The atmosphere inside was oppressive. The lights flickered and the sound of the hull groaning continued. Each step we took echoed exaggeratedly, and the air was heavy with a suffocating sense of waiting, as if we were about to witness something catastrophic. When we reached the control room, Parker was still there, motionless. The engineer began to work on the controls, trying to restart the systems, but something was wrong. The submarine wasn't responding as it should. It was as if an invisible force was manipulating the vessel, keeping us trapped. Suddenly, the lights went out again. Everything went dark, except for the faint glow of the monitors. Then the entire submarine shook, as if something were wrapping around the hull, squeezing it tightly. The structure creaked, and for a moment, I thought we would be crushed by the pressure. I looked at the monitors, and what I saw made me freeze. The creature, or whatever it was back. This time, it was clearer than before. It was not just a shadow. It was a distinct shape, with contours that seemed to dissolve and reform in the darkness. It was something that defied all logic, all scientific explanation. It was as if the ocean had given life to an entity that should not exist. It moved slowly around us, circling the submarine like a predator stalking its prey. The engineer beside me stopped working, his eyes glued to the screen, unable to look away. Parker was still motionless, oblivious to everything around him. I knew we needed to get out of there, but there was nowhere left to go. We were at the mercy of that thing. The submarine was now a prison, and we were the prisoners. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. For the first time since we began the expedition, I truly believed we would not make it home. Then, suddenly, everything stopped again. The pressure disappeared, the submarine stabilized, and the deafening sound ceased. For a brief moment, there was absolute silence. And then something even stranger happened. The monitors began to display images. They were not images of the ocean or the creature outside. They were old footage, like grainy videos of an earlier underwater expedition. The footage was dated, with faded colors and low resolution, but the scenes showed a group of scientists in a submarine similar to ours. They were exploring something in the depths, the same structure we had encountered. As we watched, I realized that the expedition shown on the screens did not end well. The team was confronted by something similar to what we had found, and one by one, the scientists disappeared. The video became more chaotic, with flashes of darkness and muffled screams. And then, just like in our situation, the submarine was dragged to the surface, but no one managed to escape. When the footage ended, the screens went black. For a long moment, no one spoke. I felt a chill run down my spine. What we were facing had happened before, and no one survived. I knew in that moment that we were doomed. Whatever it was much older and more powerful than any of us could imagine. It was not just a creature. It was something beyond human comprehension, something that did not belong to this world. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound, a soft tapping on the outside of the hull. I ran to the hatch and looked outside, expecting to see the creature again. But what I saw was even more disturbing. Outside, floating in the calm, still waters, was a body. It was one of ours, a crew member who had disappeared in the depths. He was intact, with no signs of violence, just floating there as if he had been placed there on purpose. His eyes were open, but there was no life in them. It was as if he had been left there to remind us of what was about to happen. I went back inside, my heart racing. We needed to make a decision, and fast. The engineer was still in shock, unable to act. Parker remained catatonic. I was practically alone, facing something that seemed determined to pull us back to the depths. I started fiddling with the controls, trying to reboot the systems one last time. The lights flickered again, and the submarine began to shake. But this time, I managed to achieve something. The engines roared back to life, albeit in an unstable manner. If we were lucky, we might be able to get away from that place. With the submarine finally moving, I took one last look at the monitor. The creature was still out there, watching. But this time it didn't follow us. It seemed satisfied to let us go, as if it knew that, in the end, there was no real escape. We were marked, and one way or another, we would end up back at the bottom. As we finally distanced ourselves from that place, the feeling of relief was instant but shallow. We knew we would never be completely safe. Whatever was down there was still waiting for us. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. And when that day came, we wouldn't be ready. The surface of the ocean faded behind us, but the buzzing, that terrible sound, still lingered in my mind. Even now, back in civilization, I sometimes hear that buzz in the silence of the night. And then I remember what we saw, what we discovered in the depths of the ocean. And I know that one day, the ocean will come to retrieve us again. And next time, there will be no escape.